Welcome, everybody, as the American Space Museum presents the 50th anniversary of the birth of the Space Shuttle era. We are here at the Hyatt Place Hotel with a whole bunch of friends of the American Space Museum. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. This is the first of our afternoon programs. It features former Kennedy Space Director Jay Honeycutt, but he's much more than that. He was very involved in the shuttle program with some of the launch directors you're going to meet and so forth. But we wanted to thank everyone for watching us today. We will have these programs racked up on our YouTube and Facebook channels, so you can go back and share them with your friends and family. The American Space Museum for 20 years has been preserving the birth of America's space age that began right here where we're standing in Brevard County, the delivery room of America's great space endeavors. And we're so pleased that you all came together today to honor the space workers, because that's who we truly think you're national treasures for what you've done in this great chapter of American history. Well, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Hugh Harris, who was the public relations person or the assistant for decades out there at the Kennedy Space Center. And we appreciate his enthusiasm in wanting to be the master of ceremonies today, Mr. Hugh Harris.
Oh, thank you, Mark. His voice is a little bit higher than mine. There's a lot of things that I could say about Jay Honeycutt. Jay Honeycutt, of course, was our center director and responsible for a lot of successes out at the center. We could say he was a 45-year veteran of space activities, having worked with the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, NASA, and Lockheed Martin Space Operations. He actually came to KSC as Director of Shuttle Operations and retired in 1997 as Center Director. While he was at NASA, he worked at JSC, Marshall, KSC, and spent 2 tours, and this is really tough work, at NASA headquarters. At headquarters, he dealt with top NASA management and current administration and the Congress, especially the House Science Committee. And I could say a lot more about him, so I'm not even going to say this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about secret stuff. From a personal standpoint, let me declare that Jay was the most surprising of all our center directors. The job of public affairs has always been to reach the widest audience possible. And Jay went way beyond what we were doing in public affairs. Sometimes surprising because he didn't tell us in advance. He reached out to NASCAR race drivers, competitive fishing television stars, and hundreds of motorcycle riders. He knew how the NASCAR drivers were burning their feet from the heat coming up from their roaring engines. And he solved that problem with little help from his friends at work by spinning off shuttle technology to race cars. And it's still being used at those kind of cars you see racing down the track at Daytona. And I could go on, but I'm going to let Jay talk also.
Well, I'm happy to be here today and to be part of this agenda. I will say, Mark, that when you have the masquerade ball, don't expect me to perform a similar function.
No one will know who you are.
everybody gets to talk about smoke and fire and all the good stuff that goes on out here at the center and other places within the agency. But none of it would happen without money. And that money comes from the federal government. It's allocated by the Congress and approved by the administration and sent here and to other places. And what I was going to do today is try to go through and sort of the paper trail of that money so that you can have an appreciation of how stuff in fact does get done. I'm going to start back with when Shuttle started. In what went on back in the early days that got us to the point that we're celebrating today, which is the start of work on Space Shuttle Columbia. But 40 years of work went into that before we ever got to that point, and I want to cover some of the things that happened during that time period. The first recorded evidence of efforts to provide a rocket-powered crewed vehicle into orbit was found in the work of Eugen Sanger, who was a member of the German rocket team that was at Peenemünde. Sanger was a co-worker and somewhat of a rival of Werner von Braun, who was busy working on rockets to bomb London with V1s and V2s. The Sanger's idea was to build a vehicle that was capable of going to orbit with a re-entry type design, put a crew in it, put some bombs on it, and launch it on a east to west trajectory, have it go across the Atlantic, and as it would start to re-enter, it would come down, hit the atmosphere and bounce back up, skip across the Atlantic, somewhat like when us guys were young, we used to go out to the lake and throw a rock on the water and watch it skip across the water. Well, that was the principle behind Sanger's work, and then he would have it continue to either land at one of the Japanese-held islands in the Pacific or come back around and land in Germany. His work never gained any real favor with Hitler, who was more interested in building bombers, but he wanted ones that could be used to bomb in Europe and Russia, and he didn't have his work never gained any. Sanger's work never gained any favor with Hitler, and therefore he never got it beyond the paperwork stage. It also turned out that some of his assumptions, specifically regarding atmospheric reentry heating, were incorrect. It may not have worked, but he had some other things that were used as a foundation for lifting body development. This same process by Hitler caused him not to approve the jet fighter, which was first brought out by the German scientists in 1939 timeframe. And again, he didn't approve development of it because it was not a bomber. The Germans finally did have a jet fighter in 1944, which was before either we or the British could form one. After the war, they found 2 copies of Sanger's report. One was in the hands of Joe Stalin in Moscow, and the other came to the U.S. with Walter Dornberger, who was the head of the German rocket team at Peenemünde. Dornberger came into the U.S. as part of Operation Paperclip, which you'll remember was the way the German scientists all flocked to surrender to the American troops at the end of the war because they didn't want to get caught by the Russians. And most of them were brought into Mexico, and then in the dark of night they became basically the first recorded illegal aliens to come across into the U.S. And they ended up at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, as part of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. They also were the foundation of the Marshall Space Flight Center management team when NASA was formed in 1978. Copy, when Dornberger came, he brought a copy of this Sanger's report, and he gave it to the Navy and the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was at Langley and was the forerunner of the NASA. The NACA study team was led by Dr. Robert Gilruth, along with Max Fugere, Chris Kraft, and others, who became the core management team in Houston at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now known as the Johnson Space Center, when it was established in 1961. Subsequent work by all these groups, Dornberger went to Bell. The rest of them primarily went into NASA. And Bell and others began a lot of work on designs that evolved into the X-15 and Dinosaur programs, which flew in the 57 to 68 timeframe in this country. And during this same time frame, other government and industry teams were studying potential applications of crewed, reusable, rocket-powered lifting body type vehicles. These studies were primarily funded through either NASA planning money or, as Lee mentioned earlier, corporate R&D or internal corporate funds. But before we get into the congressional involvement, I was going to do a quick 40,000-foot review from our high school 10th grade civics course that I'm sure some of you have forgotten as to how the Congress actually works. As we know, there are two houses, the House of Representatives and Senate, each based on population. The House is based on population, while the Senate has 2 reps per state. House and Senate has a number of committees, some permanent and some other ones that are sort of as needed. There are 20 standing committees or permanent committees in the House, 16 in the Senate. Space is represented on the House Science, Space, Technology, and Senate, and the Senate Commerce, Science, and Technology standing committees. Each of these has 3 to 5 subcommittees. Each subcommittee has a chair. Membership is along party lines, with the party in power having the majority, but not all the members. Chairmanship of the committee and subcommittees are normally the most senior member of the party in power. In the House, all the committees are authorization committees, which means that they determine the sort of goodness or worth of an item. The remaining committee is the Appropriations Committee, which determines how much money would be spent for that item. An agency like NASA begins its annual budget process by getting a mark or target from the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which represents the administration's desired content and the spending for the year. The agency then develops a spend plan to meet the given objectives. This plan is passed back through OMB and then delivered to the Congress. This is the kickoff of the annual budget process by someone like the Kennedy Space Center, and it consists of a number of presentations and defenses to the Congress. Normally it begins at the House subcommittee level, then progresses to full committee, and then on to full House membership. Amendments and similar and significant give and take occurs during this process, and as amendments are presented at each level, they're dispositioned by committee vote. After passage of the budget bill in the House, it goes to the Senate, follows a similar path, then goes back to OMB and on to the President for signature. In 1964, even though no money had been authorized by Congress, the House Science Committee, specifically the Space Subcommittee under Congressman Tiger Teague from Texas, was beginning to ask NASA about follow-on programs to Apollo, specifically about reusable vehicles. In 65, Teague sent a letter to NASA asking about follow-on to NASA centers to provide the committee with recommendations. He sent similar letters to contractors and got no significant response from either. The next year, in July of 66, the committee published their annual report with a specific recommendation to begin work in support of a shuttle-type vehicle and report back to the Congress by December. NASA responded with all the Apollo activities going on, some of the budget pressures that they were facing that were caused by Vietnam. They were too busy. Although they didn't respond directly to the committee as requested, Studies did continue within the agency and the contractors, primarily in the areas of vehicle configuration, propulsion systems, again covered under internal funding of one type or another. In '69, President Nixon formed a Space Task Group, which was chaired by Vice President Agnew, with members being the science advisor to the President, the NASA administrator, and the Secretary of the Air Force. This group reported out to the President with a series of options. The Vice President recommended, among other things, that the U.S. land a crew on Mars by the end of the century. This recommendation gathered little support in NASA or in the Congress. But they also recommended the development of a crewed, reusable, chemically fueled shuttle operating between the Earth and low Earth orbit. This recommendation got powerful support from the House Science Committee, especially Chairman Teague's Space Subcommittee. As an example of how the more things change, the more they're the same, the following is an excerpt from the 1970 Science Committee report. The bloody carnage in Vietnam, the plight of the cities, the revolt on the campuses, the monetary woes of budget deficits and inflation, and widespread determination to reorder priorities has pushed the space programs lower in national support. Any of that sound familiar? The 70 budget hearings began in subcommittee with Teague proposing an increase of $80 million to the NASA shuttle station budget submission, an overall increase of $300 million to the total NASA budget. At that time, the NASA budget submittal was a combined shuttle and station under one line item. In full committee, opponents of the increases offered amendments, basically cutting all that money out of the subcommittee recommendation. After rousing debate in the full committee, the vote was to cut the money resulted in a tie in the full committee, and by House rules that meant it failed. So the bill passed and went to the full House, passed with a 229 to 105 vote. 71 budget hearings, NASA dropped station out of the combined shuttle numbers, causing most of the opposition that existed previously to go away. Subcommittee again recommended small increase, which was approved by the full committee. Key members of the 71 budget cycle were Don Fuqua and Lou Fry of Florida. Fuqua, as most of you know, is from Gainesville and was a representative from that area for some period of time. And Lou Fry was, at that time, held the position that Bill Posey has today as a representative from here in Brevard County. Also of interest to those in the House who were involved in the House investigation of Challenger, Bob Seek and Bob Lang. This was the year that Bob Rowe joined the committee. Few of us have kind memories of Mr. Rowe. As support for shuttle rose in the House, the Senate was another thing. Opposition led by Senators Mondale, Muskie, Proxmire, Fulbright, and others became a difficult hill for NASA to climb. But it wasn't strong enough to defeat the Senate in the full Senate, and it lost by 32 to 28 in the NASA budget request in the Senate. The final big battle of 71 was where to locate the shuttle launch site. Fuqua and Fry strongly pushed for Cape Kennedy. The chairman of the Senate Space Committee, who was from New Mexico, pushed for White Sands. The chair of the House Science Committee, who was from California, pushed for Vandenberg. Chairman Teague sided with Fuqua, and NASA ended up selecting KSC on the East Coast and Vandenberg on the West Coast as the launch sites. On January the 5th in 72, Nixon announced his shuttle decision favoring a two-person crew recoverable orbiter with unmanned boosters and expendable fuel tanks. Nixon also approved $200 million for shuttle development, $20 million for construction of facilities funding, most of which would be spent here at Kennedy. Initial development cost estimates were $5.15 billion, plus or minus 20%. The actual costs have been hard to determine, but the consensus best guess is $6.7 billion in 1971 dollars, which is about 18% plus of that. At the same time, the OMB came out to NASA and told them to stop giving plus or minus estimates on budgets. And of note, just after Nixon's announcement, the 72 Democratic presidential campaign ticket of George McGovern and Thomas Eagleton was campaigning here in Florida and vowed to cancel the program if elected. Obviously, they had similar things in other states because they only carried Massachusetts and D.C. in the general election. In the August 72 budget cycle, Teague added $200 million to Shuttle in his hearings, which is exactly what NASA had recommended but had been cut by the OMB. In a full-fledged fight, and that's hard to say quickly, opponents attempted to eliminate additional Shuttle funding and to have the National Academy of Science conduct a study to determine if Shuttle was worthwhile doing. This attempt failed in the House by 277 to 60 vote, and the $200 million plus up survived both House and Senate for a total budget allocation in that year of $5.5 billion, which I think is equivalent to $35 billion in today's dollars. Today's NASA budget is $24 billion, so it gives you a kind of a sense of how significant percentage-wise that was. NASA awarded the initial shuttle contract of $2.6 billion to North American, who won a competition with Lockheed, Grumman, and McDonnell Douglas for the contract. Rockwell gave major subs to Grumman and MacDac, and the thermal protection development subcontract that Terry talked about this morning to Lockheed. The SSME contract, or what is it, Lee, RS-28 or what, contract had been given to Rocketdyne the previous year. Subsequent contracts were given to Martin of the external tank and Thiokol for the solid rocket motors. Major design changes from Nixon's original decree followed, along with some configuration changes driven by the U.S. Air Force requirements, which included a 65,000-pound payload capability of 15 by 60-foot payload bay and 1,100-plus mile cross-range capability. This latter requirement drove the Delta wing design, and the larger lift capability and payload bay were to satisfy some of the NRO satellites that the Air Force was wanting to fly. Work began at Palmdale on Enterprise in Columbia in April of 72. In 73, Congressman Teague moved up to chair the full House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and Fuqua became the subcommittee chair. Nothing could have been better for NASA and for KSC, because Mr. Fuqua in his position was and continues to be a true friend to NASA and to us. The 73 budget was again challenged on the full floor, but opponents were defeated, as were the 74 and 75 budgets. In 76, the first significant cut to NASA by the Congress occurred with a $180 million reduction in bottom line budget by the House, some of which did affect Shuttle. Now, meanwhile, back to the fun stuff. Enterprise rolled out in September of 76 and began test and checkout in support of the approach and landing test out at Edwards. ALT consisted of 3 distinct phases: a mated, unpowered, uncrewed test to verify the flight characteristics of the mated, as you remember, that's the 747 with the orbiter on top. They flew around in that configuration to make sure the flight characteristics of the 747 haven't been changed. Then they put a crew in it, flew it some more flights, and then flew 5 unpowered flights. Now, there was some, in the minds of some people, there was question as to whether when you popped the orbiter off the 747, whether it was going to hit the vertical tail of the 747 or not. And a lot of analysis had been done, and everything said it was going to be all right. But out in Houston, there was a guy named John Kiker who was a model airplane enthusiast, and John built a scale model orbiter, a scale model 747, put him on the back, and he went out in the field there at JSC, and he flew the approach and landing test, and he would go out there at quitting time. So and it's right by the front gate JSC, and he'd be out there flying, everybody quit, get out of their car and watch it, and there'd be a huge traffic jam throughout the center. Then Columbia arrived down here in March of '79 with first flight in April of '81. Now, I'm going to leave it to Bob Seek and Jim Harrington and Mike Leinbach to discuss what happened then until the first flight. Teague had retired from the Congress in '79, and Fuqua became full committee chair, where again he's a true friend to NASA. Big moment occurred in '79 when Fuqua, now committee chairman, addressed the full House in support of a $185 million supplemental spending bill for NASA that was required to keep the first flight on schedule. When Fuqua retired from Congress in '87, he was replaced by Mr. Rowe as committee chairman. Now, historically, NASA has been given positive bipartisan support from both the House and the Senate and their respective oversight committees. Similar support has generally come from the administration over the years. However, there have been a few bumps along the way, as you would expect, with hearings on NASA supplemental budget requests in the early shuttle days to perhaps the worst, which occurred in the budget cycle of 1993, when there was a concerted effort in the House to cancel Space Station. The station vote in the House passed by one vote, 216 to 215, and allowed station to continue. Future year funding and congressional support established by Fuqua and by Teague and then perpetuated by Fuqua continue to serve the agency, and it has continued to serve the agency over time. The current House Science Committee chair is Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas. Congressman Don Byer from Virginia is the Space Subcommittee chairman. Familiar names on the subcommittee are Charlie Crist, Bill Posey, and Daniel Webster of Florida. The Senate Commerce Committee is chaired by, Space Committee is chaired by Maria Cantwell from Washington State. John Hickenlooper from Colorado is the subcommittee chairman. Familiar names on that committee are Tammy Baldwin, Kristen Sinema, Abby Klobuchar, Tammy Duckworth, Ted Cruz, Ms. Blackburn of Tennessee, and Ron Johnson, Wisconsin, and Rick Scott of Florida. Familiar names on the subcommittee are Cruz, Sinema, and Rick Scott. So that's all I had. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to try to pass them on to Seek and
Pencils and paper, and we'll have a 10-question quickie quiz here. Very good there, Mr. Honeycutt. Any questions for this gentleman? One final slide I want to show there, Jessica, is before you do that, we still have a reusable spaceship. People don't talk about it much. There it is. Still orbiting Earth. The Rockwell X-37B is doing some unknown things overhead there. Do you know anything about that? We can tell. No, sure.
I don't have enough bullets to,
Oh, well, let's give Mr. Honeycutt another big hand. We are one more before we go out. We're gonna say goodbye to our social media outlet and then come right back in. And oral histories like this are made possible for the American Space Museum by a grant that we received from the Marie Louise G. West Endowment here in Brevard County, and we're so grateful for that. It actually bought the equipment that we could do this, and we've been doing a program called Stay Curious about space history, space workers, and occasional astronaut for 2 years. We've done, well, this is technically our 531st episode, so we appreciate everybody embracing that. And wherever's my boss, Karen Conklin, looks like we made a good decision not to have this at the museum, huh? Yeah. We thank you all for supporting this, and we will be back at about 2:40 with 2 astronauts, Mike McCulley, and I don't see Winston Scott here yet, but we've got someone that could sub. And I've only gotten through this week by this Earthling's statement, go slow to go fast. So thank you all. You can sit where you're at, mingle a little bit, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes. to bridge the space between us.